Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Let's see, where's the best place to put this? There we go. I guess that'll work. Welcome back. So this is going to be a pretty short video, and it is going to accompany um, uh, uh, worksheet number 6 and all the film clips that kind of coincide with that. All right. And basically, what we're doing here is we're going to fill in the blanks, but and that I'm painting with a broad brush. So we're going to fill in the space, the blanks between the arrival of the swing era, which is the 1930s and the 40s, when jazz and big bands dominated the popular music charts and radio, and it was just more than half of all pop tunes were basically big band performed by big bands or big bands with singers and that kind of stuff. That's peak jazz popularity. Okay. And everything we've been talking about up until now has been the beginnings of jazz. We talked about the early elements, the early contributing elements in New Orleans, racial elements, music from different cultures, black music in particular, the blues, ragtime piano, and other forms of piano like stride and boogie woogie, and just all these sort of things, mixing together, arriving at New Orleans style Dixieland, and then that spreading across the country and slowly modifying. Right, we talked about Chicago style Dixieland. I gave you a good deal of information about Louis Armstrong. So chronologically, we're kind of in the 1920s now, and so we need to fill in this gap from Dixieland, small sort of Dixieland bands, 1920s, which would be 5, 6, 7 piece groups, to big bands, which are going to be 14, 15, 16 piece groups in the 30s. So this is how we do it. This is kind of the in-between stuff. This is the transition. Okay. So this is the predecessors or movement towards big bands. And I'm going to give you 3 people in particular. Now, 2 of these people that we're going to talk about aren't necessarily playing jazz. They are playing remnants of previous styles of music or slowly evolving styles of music, but I wouldn't call what they were doing full-blown jazz. But again, this is part of the transition in a sense. And you will see, I hope, once we get to the swing era, you'll kind of see where some of these types of music we talk about today continued. Okay. And I'll try and tie all that together when we get there. All right. All right. So if you haven't watched the film clip already, this will kind of get you started. If you have watched it, this will just reinforce what you just watched and did. Okay. So one of the most important figures of the 19-teens, the 1920s in African American music was a guy by the name of James Reese Europe. James Reese Europe became famous as the leader of a all-black dance band for Vernon and Irene Castle. The Castles were famous ballroom dancers. They were actually sort of media celebrities of the 19-teens and 1920s, the World War I era. And they were very cosmopolitan, very safe looking, and by safe I mean white. So they were very much high society sorts of folks, and they would have ballroom dancing classes and teach people how to dance. They published books about how to dance. There's a book called Modern Dancing written by the Castles. They appeared in silent films dancing, which would again sort of show people how to do these dance steps and that kind of stuff. They were very well known, and they would go to large events and dance and teach other people how to dance and all that kind of stuff. Well, we're right at a position historically here where there is, in the 19-teens, basically, there's the older generation that dances to more European derived traditional dances, waltzes in particular, other white European dance traditions. Okay, and the castles were great at that, and they helped people, learn how to do that. But we're also now, with the rise of ragtime in particular, which is now being taken over by Dixieland bands. You have the rise of new dance steps, and these new dance steps were modeled off of loosely based on African American styles, and they were given these sort of typically animal type names like the turkey trot, the grizzly bear, the foxtrot, the bunny hug, stuff like that. And a lot of these dances, they're faster because this music is faster and more syncopated. So it's not your traditional waltz. Let's just say that. Okay. So for a lot of reasons, the old generation didn't approve of this new dancing. It was too risque. It wasn't as you held your partner in different ways and not in such a conservative, old-fashioned way. It was faster and sort of more elaborate and that kind of stuff. And a big part of the problem is they were derived from African American styles. So a lot of older white folks may have shunned these dances or frowned upon them just purely because they were modeled off of African American type of dances. Okay, so that's where the castles come in. The castles being very, again, sophisticated, very white, very safe, very well respected. When the castles would do the grizzly bear or the foxtrot or the bunny hop or bunny hug or whatever, it would then open the door to all these sort of middle America white families who originally would not have allowed their children to do these dances. But now that they see the castles doing them, well, if the castles, these very famous, well-known, well-to-do folks can do these dances or do these dances at all, maybe it's okay if my kids do these dances, right? The same thing will happen musically. There's going to be a couple of people that sort of bridge the gap. They're going to make jazz, which again was an African-American creation. It's going to make it more acceptable to the mainstream. Those people will traditionally be white, but by playing black music or some modifications of authentic jazz, they're going to make jazz more appropriate to the masses. A strange side effect is it's typically the white groups that are more popular, and therefore they make the most money, and history remembers them a little bit more. The white bands weren't really innovating a whole lot. It was the black bands that were doing all the innovation and challenging and trying new things. But it's the white bands that sort of benefited from it because that's just the way society was in the United States in the 20s, in the 30s, and the 40s. Okay. All right. So back to this. James Reese Europe became famous with his group, his black group, playing for the castles. They played popular tunes, and their most popular was the Memphis Blues, which the castles created the famous foxtrot. So James Reese Europe before this was actually a ragtime piano player, a conductor of black Broadway productions. He himself was black, and he arrived in New York and found that there weren't many opportunities for African American musicians. There's a musicians union. It's called the American Federation of Musicians. And if some people need music, if they needed a group or they needed something, they would often call the musicians union. The musicians union would put together a group and say, go to this place at this time, with your instrument, and you'll get paid, basically, right, to play a concert. So if the Vanderbilts or the Carnegies or some really well-to-do family is throwing some sort of ball, they would call the musicians union. They would arrange to have a band come and play so people could dance, right? The problem is the musicians union at this time was segregated. It was white. It was predominantly white. So There's also this crazy sort of stipulation that if you wanted to play European-derived dance music, again, waltzes, polkas, things like that, you needed to hire a white European-type band. If you wanted to play the new, highly syncopated, faster ragtime-type music, you needed to hire a black band to do that. Of course, that's ridiculous. Any good musician can play any kind of music, but that's just kind of how it was back then. So James Reese Europe took advantage of this. He started his own sort of musicians union, like social club for African American musicians. It was called the Clef Club. And it became pretty famous with a Clef Club orchestra. And so you get to a certain point where, again, Vanderbilt's, Carnegie's, some famous well-to-do family wants to throw some sort of soiree. They call the musicians union and they get a white band to play music for the older folks, the waltzes and whatnot. And then they call the Clef Club and they get a black band to play the new hot syncopated music for the younger kids to dance these new steps to, the foxtrot, the grizzly bear, and whatnot, right? It was at one of these social events where the Castles were there to dance and to mingle and to help other people dance. It was at one of these highbrow events that the Castles met James Reese Europe and heard his band, and they were fascinated by his group's ability to play this really highly syncopated, complex music. So they hired him. They said, "You're going to be the new band leader for the Castles, and you and your band are gonna record for us and play for us and that kind of stuff." So this is actually one of the first really prominent examples of integration in the music. Even though the Castles weren't musicians, they were dancers. It's the first really big example of well-known white artists, in this case the Castles, teaming up with a well-known black artist, and that would be James Reese Europe. Okay, I've actually uploaded the tune Memphis Blues for you, and it was actually not recorded by the dance orchestra, the Society Orchestra. It was recorded by the Hellfighters Infantry Band. During World War I, the military was segregated, and the good African-American men of Harlem wanted to fight for the cause. The U.S. military created an infantry specifically from Harlem. It was an all-black infantry. They were nicknamed the Hellfighters, and every infantry has an infantry band. They needed an infantry band leader, and so they basically drafted James Reese Europe to become the leader of the Hellfighter Band. And that position is an officer position, and it led to all kinds of amazing things that I'm surprised more people don't know about James Reese Europe. He was the first black officer to see battle in World War I, or he might have been the first officer, period, to encounter enemy fire in World War I. Just all kinds of amazing firsts with James Reese Europe. So it's that band that did some recording after the war, and they played highly syncopated, tunes for dancing. They would even take like national anthems of other countries and play them in a syncopated ragtime style, right? After the war, James Reese Europe led his own band to record this sort of combination of marches and ragtime that they had been doing during the war. Unfortunately, they didn't do that for too long because he was killed by one of his musicians. They got into an argument after a concert, and he stabbed him in the neck, and he bled out and he died. It was really quite sad, particularly because of the innovation that James Reese Europe was bringing to the music. If he could have lived another 20 years or so, it would have been interesting to see what would have happened. But again, one of those famous firsts, he was the first black man granted an official New York City funeral. All kinds of interesting things about James Reese Europe. So I've uploaded 2 pieces by his groups. Again, the Memphis Blues is recorded by the infantry band, so it's big. It's like a military band. But check it out; it's not jazz at all. It's all written out, but it shows the highly syncopated music, and it shows that it can be played by large groups, not just small Dixieland bands. And then the other piece I uploaded was a tune called the Castle House Rag, which was written for the Castles. And that is recorded by Europe's Society Orchestra. And what a society orchestra is basically a band that can play all kinds of different music for dancing. It's not exactly a jazz band. There's not a lot of improvisation, if any, but it's a smaller group, somewhere in between the size of a full-blown military band and a Dixieland band. So I would argue there's, in a society orchestra, there's probably 12, 13, 14 members, and they are playing the Castle House Rag. So go check out both. Pause this video and go listen to both the Memphis Blues and the Castle House Rag, right? And then come back and we'll talk about a few more people. Go. Okay. The next person I want to talk about is Paul Whiteman. Paul Whiteman was a classical musician. He was a violinist. His dad was, in fact, a music educator. So Paul Whiteman learned about music the traditional European way. You see some music on a page and you reproduce it on your instrument, in his case, a violin. One day, Paul Whiteman heard some Dixieland in California, and he was fascinated, and he decided to put his violin away and start working in this new hot jazz idiom, right? What you need to understand about how Paul Whiteman approached the music is this. As a classically trained Western musician, you learn to read the notes on the page and then reproduce them. And that's typically how you play. So let's take a famous, well-known piece, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Bum, 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 that piece, right? If you went and heard the Milwaukee Symphony play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, it would be note perfect. They've played it dozens, if not hundreds of times. Everybody in the group knows how it goes. So there'd be 60 musicians on stage. They'd play it perfectly. But what they would be playing is they would be playing all the notes that Beethoven wrote, right? And the very next day, you could go hear the Chicago Symphony play it. They played it hundreds of times, and they'd play it, again, note perfect. But they're only playing the notes on the page. And it might sound a little different because you have different conductors. There might be different tempos at certain spots. There might be the individuals themselves sound different. The flute section of one orchestra sounds a little different than the flute section of another orchestra. So it might be slightly different. But generally, they're playing the notes and only the notes that Beethoven wrote. Okay, that's where Paul Whiteman's coming from. By now, you've hopefully understand that jazz doesn't work that way. Jazz requires improvisation. Jazz requires spontaneity. Jazz is different every single day. Paul Whiteman didn't do different every single day. So instead of having his musicians improvise a great deal, he instead wrote out everything he wanted them to play, but he tried to write it out in a style. He tried to write it out rhythmically and in a style and in the harmonies that sounded like jazz. So it kind of sounds like jazz, or jazz light in a sense, but there isn't a whole lot of improvisation. There isn't a whole lot of fresh new things. They would play the same thing night after night after night after night. And it would, so if you heard them Tuesday and then went back and heard them again on Saturday, it would be essentially the same. Whereas if it was more authentic jazz with a lot of improvisation, that would not be the case, right? So as these things usually happen, however, you're kind of watering it down to the lowest common denominator. But that stuff tends to be very, very popular. It doesn't necessarily last a long time. It's not particularly innovative. But for a moment, it can be very, very popular because it appeals to the greatest amount of people. And that's what Paul Whiteman was at this time. He appealed to a large amount of people and was very popular. In fact, he led the band that became the most popular white band in the 1920s, basically. He was actually called the King of Jazz. He was that popular. Ironically, the music his band is playing is very little jazz. Very little. Some of these tunes are literally no jazz, like not jazz at all. They don't swing. They don't improvise. Nothing. But a little bit, a handful of other tunes would be played in a swinging style, and maybe there'd be small bits of improvisation. But as a general rule, Paul Whiteman's group is playing very, very little jazz. Okay, he had some big hits like Whispering and Japanese Sandman. Again, billed as jazz by record companies, it's not jazz. But because he was called the king of jazz, and because it was sold as jazz, a lot of people who otherwise would not have purchased jazz because perhaps it's black music and some people from middle America didn't want to listen to black music. Here you have Paul Whiteman, who was white, and again, sort of tuxedo, everybody looks very sophisticated and that kind of stuff. Here you have a guy called the king of jazz, but he looks like me, he's white, right? So they can buy those records, and it can sort of, in a backwards way, it sort of opens the door of jazz to a family or to some people who would have been reluctant otherwise. So initially, it's kind of unfortunate that they have to get their jazz through a guy who's not really playing a lot of jazz. But if they think they're buying jazz, they buy a Paul Whiteman record now, then since I'm listening to jazz, I like jazz, that means maybe they'll buy a Duke Ellington record later, or maybe they'll buy a Count Basie record later, and they'll get into more authentic jazz played by African Americans. Okay. As an example of this not jazz, actually, Paul Whiteman's orchestra commissioned the popular songwriter and a gentleman who also got into writing classical music, a composer by the name of George Gershwin. He commissioned George Gershwin to write a piece which was essentially a classical piano concerto, but it has blues and jazz sort of inflections. It's got a saxophone section. It has bluesy sounding tonalities and stuff. And it's a very well-known piece called Rhapsody in Blue. It was given on a concert by the Paul Whiteman Orchestra called An Experiment in Modern Music. Rhapsody in Blue is not jazz. It's played by orchestras and not improvised. All the other music on this concert, An Experiment in Modern Music, was not jazz at all. But because it was Paul Whiteman, it was a big deal. He was billed as the king of jazz. It's all sort of mushed together here. And again, that is in some ways unfortunate. In other ways, it sort of opens the door to people who may not have otherwise bought jazz. It kind of lets them slow walk into it, basically. Okay, I uploaded Whispering for you, and I want you to go pause the video and go listen to it. And when you do, there's a famous the Whispering tune is dee da 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 dee da 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 dee da. It's that melody, and they're going to play through that melody. There's an introduction, and then they play through the melody like 2 or 3 times. Then they play the introduction again, and then they come back and they play that same tune that I sang poorly a few more times. You'll hear it so many times that the melody itself doesn't change. The instrumentation changes. Sometimes it's a trumpet. Sometimes it's a trombone. One time it's a slide whistle or something, right? The instrumentation changes, but the tune itself does not change. Until the very, very end, the very, very last time, the trumpet player kind of tries to rag up the melody. And so listen for that. It's not done very well, but I think that shows you the extent of improvisation in the Paul Whiteman Orchestra. Okay, so pause this, go listen to Whispering, and then come back for one more person. Okay, go. All right, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed Whispering. The last person I want to talk about is sort of the counterpart to Paul Whiteman. Paul Whiteman had the most popular white band in America, and they were basically in New York. And it was a society-type band that could play dance music for all kinds of things, right? The most popular black band in America was led by Fletcher Henderson. And they were also in New York. They played at the Roseland Ballroom and other places like that. Mr. Henderson was originally from Georgia. He moved to New York to study chemistry at Columbia University. He ran out of money, and he grew up playing the piano. His mother was a piano teacher, sort of thing. So he just started working in the music business, and then it just continued, basically. What Fletcher Henderson did, he doesn't get a lot of credit, but it should not be overlooked. Fletcher Henderson basically established what would become a jazz band, would become a swing band. He was one of the first to have a group that resembled a jazz band, with 4 different sections: trumpets, trombones, saxophones, and a rhythm section. His band is a little bit smaller than what big bands would become. Big bands would usually have 4 trumpets, 3 or 4 trombones, 5 saxophones, and piano, bass, drums, and guitar. Fletcher Henderson was similar, but a smaller section: 3 trumpets, 2 trombones, 4 reeds or saxophones, along with clarinets and that kind of stuff. So just a little bit smaller. But what he did is the way he arranged his music, and the way he had other people in his band write music, the way they arranged music became sort of the language of how future big band arrangers would write. So they would often write in sections. The saxophones would play as a section, the trombones would play as a section, and the brass could play, and the saxophones would play something else, and they kind of had these dialogues back and forth and all this kind of stuff. It became sort of the standard way to do it, and we owe a lot of that to Fletcher Henderson. Fletcher Henderson himself thought that too much improvisation was almost dreary, quote, almost dreary unless the improvisers were really exceptional. This is the guy who found the most exceptional improviser in Louis Armstrong and brought him to New York. So he hired him away from King Oliver in Chicago, brought him to New York to make his band more swinging, more exciting, better, more popular, right? That's Fletcher Henderson. As I said, Fletcher Henderson's band was the best black band in New York, playing at the Roseland Ballroom and some other places, including well-known musicians like Coleman Hawkins, Lester Young, who would go on to play with the Count Basie Band, Don Redman. Again, hired Louis Armstrong in 1924, transforming his more sort of society, stiff ragtime society orchestra into a swinging jazz band. This is really kind of where it all happens. And then, unfortunately, by the time swing bands really take off and become super popular, Fletcher Henderson's star had waned by that point, and it had run its course by the end of the 20s, early 30s, and that's when all these other bands started going and taking what Fletcher Henderson did and running with it. One example of that would be that Fletcher Henderson actually sold his book of arrangements. Composers and arrangers, we call them books. It's just all the music they ever wrote for big bands. Well, Fletcher Henderson had hundreds of charts, hundreds of tunes that had been arranged for his band. As his band was on the decline, he actually sold his arrangements to Benny Goodman. Benny Goodman was, we'll talk about in the next video, actually on the strength of these Fletcher Henderson arrangements, he became known as the King of Swing. Again, ironically, Fletcher Henderson, black man, black band; Benny Goodman, King of Swing, white man, white band. But again, as I alluded to earlier in our lecture here, it was oftentimes, this will not be the first time, that white musicians sort of gain fame and wealth by copying. I will say copying in this case, or emulating. I will not say stealing, because Benny Goodman did not steal anything from Fletcher Henderson necessarily, but emulating black artists. Okay, we will talk more about that later as well. So I uploaded one Fletcher Henderson tune just to give you an idea of the direction his band is going and where we're going to be with the swing era. That's a tune called "Wrappin' It Up." In this tune, as you're listening to "Wrappin' It Up," unlike Paul Whiteman's "Whispering," "Wrapping It Up" has some solo space for good soloists. So there is going to be a tenor saxophone solo where the saxophone solo gets to improvise for an entire chorus, an entire 32 bars. He's making stuff up in the moment. You will hear the band playing things behind the soloist. Their parts are written out. They're like, behind the saxophone, we're supposed to play these parts. But the saxophone player who is soloing is improvising. He's making that up. You're going to hear a trumpet solo, I believe. You're going to hear a little bit of a clarinet solo. Same thing. The band is playing written out arrangements, so they're looking off music. But when a soloist takes over, that soloist is spontaneously creating this music. They know what the chords are. They know what the other members of the group are doing. So they're creating some music in the moment. Paul Whiteman's band didn't really do that very well. All the groups of James Reese Europe did not do that. They were a society orchestra. They played the music that was there for them, that was written down for them, didn't improvise. So over the course of these sorts of groups, hopefully I've shown you how larger groups can sort of start to incorporate improvisation and adapt to this new jazz style, moving away from just a society dance orchestra into more of an actual jazz band or a swing band. Okay, so you have a couple things to listen to: two James Reese Europes, a Paul Whiteman, and a Fletcher Henderson. You have a video clip to watch. It's number 6, worksheet number 6, if you haven't already seen it. And that's it for this particular lecture. All right. There'll be more after this, of course. We'll see you guys next time. All right. Thank you, of course, as always. And see you soon. Bye-bye.